Hi, Peter Charles here, Hooked for Life Fly Fishing, and let's talk about sinking lines. Don't run away. They're not that scary. I know a lot of people don't want to fish sinking lines. They look at them as being too difficult. They don't need them, blah, 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 blah. The reality is sinking lines give fly fishers a tremendous advantage when we want to get big fish and fish effectively. Over here in North America, we have a pretty strong affection for floating lines or sink tips. So we'll hang a sinking material on the end of a floater. You don't see too many sinking lines being used. If we're over in Europe or the UK, that's different. Sinking lines are quite common. You just have to look on a European line manufacturer's website and you'll see all sorts of sinking lines. Here, not so much. I mean, yeah, there are some being sold and there are some being offered, but the reality is most anglers don't use them. Now, a little personal story. When I started fly fishing in the late 60s, I couldn't afford anything really exotic. All I had was a level floater and a level Type 3 sinker. And my first fish came on that Type 3 sinker. I've always had an affinity for sinking lines and knowing how well they fish and how effectively they fish. So let's start off by saying, what do I mean by a sinking line? Well, when we're talking about sink tips, everybody's got that. There's a floater section and then there's a sink tip hanging off the end. Everybody's kind of used to that concept. Well, a full sinking line is a line where the whole thing sinks, or at least the entire head of the line sinks. You've got basically two flavors. First off, we'll talk about the striper line here. It's a full intermediate line, and you can see in this diagram it's all one color. And that means the head and the running line are made of the same material and they all sink at the same rate. So, okay, let's look at this other line. This is the Airflow Streamer Max Short. You can see that the front section of the line is heavy sinking material. The blue belly section is an intermediate, and the orange running line floats. So you've got these two flavors in full sinking lines. The entire line sinks, or just the head of the line sinks, and the running line floats. Now, right off the bat, you're going to say, why bother having two? Well, they give you different advantages. They fish differently. They handle differently. And I'll have a subsequent video coming up in a few days where I'll be talking about fishing full sinking lines, and we'll get into why you might want one or the other. So let's get going and talk about the nature of the full sinking lines and what choices we have and how they're put together. So let's start off with your standard floater. This is a cross-section of a typical 6-weight, let's say, and you can see you have a floating material, the green stuff, and then you have the inner core of the fly line. So it doesn't matter if you had a floater, an intermediate, or a sinker, they can all have the same core material. And here's the important thing. If you're talking a 6-weight line, it doesn't matter if it's a floater, an intermediate, or a full sinker, they're all a 6-weight line. They all have the same weight. So in other words, if it's 160 grains over 30 feet for the floater, it's 160 grains over 30 feet for the sinker. And it fools a lot of people because when they put the full sinker in their hands, it feels heavier. And it feels heavier to cast, too. And there's reasons for that, which we'll get into. But let's talk about construction for a minute. The material, that green material, is polyvinyl chloride for most manufacturers, or for airflow, it'll be polyurethane. Now, neither of these two materials float. They will sink slowly if you were to drop them into water. In order to get them to float, they have to add what we call microbeads. They're little hollow beads that decrease the overall density of the material and allow the fly line to float. So that's how you put a floater together. Now, when we do an intermediate, a little simpler. We don't need the little microbeads. We can just use straight PVC or straight polyurethane, and it sinks at its natural rate, which is roughly 1.5 inches per second. Now we get into the intermediate. As you can see, the overall diameter is smaller, okay, but the weight is the same. So that's important. We've shrunk the overall diameter of the line down because we've got less stuff in it. but it is the same line weight. Okay, let's move on to the Type 3. Now, the Type 3 has even less material than intermediate. So you're saying to yourself, okay, so there's less material, it's going to weigh less. That's right, that's true. It will weigh less. However, what they do is they impregnate it with tungsten, which is a heavy material. So we bring the weight back up to that of a 6 weight. And that now allows it to sink at roughly 3 inches per second. Okay, let's move on to the last one, which is a Type 6. You can see there's even less material, less plastic there, less PVC, less polyurethane, and even more tungsten. So again, it still weighs the same as a 6 weight, but now it'll sink at around 6 inches per second. Now, let's get on to that whole business of inches per second. We're talking about sink rates, how fast it goes down. Intermediate's around 1.5, Type 3 is 3 inches, Type 6 is around 6 inches. The important thing is those are still water sink rates. You use them in current, you don't get that sink rate because something is going on here in current. This piece of doweling, let's say, is our full sinker. We're at one end holding it up, all right, and the other end is sinking. So as this end sinks, we've got gravity pulling it down, but we've got the force of the current of the water pushing it back up. And what happens is it reaches an equilibrium where gravity is canceled by the force of the water. And it stays at that level as it swings through current as long as the current strength remains the same. If the current speeds up, it will come up a bit, and if the current slows down, it will drop a bit. So that's what you're going to see happening with a sink tip or a full sinker. Anytime you put sinking line in water. It's true of mono too, by the way. It's true of fluorocarbon. If you were just to put some split shot on the end of some fluorocarbon and some mono, it would do the same thing in current. So you've got this idea of gravity being canceled out by the current strength pushing back up onto the line. So when we go from a Type 3 to a Type 6 full sinking line, you see that the Type 3 has a larger diameter, but it weighs the same as the Type 6. So because the Type 3 has a larger diameter, it has more drag. Because it has more drag, it has more lift. So it doesn't sink as much in current. Now, imagine for a moment you're standing beside a swimming pool, and you had a piece of intermediate and a piece of full sinker, and say a piece of Type 3 and a piece of Type 6, 1 foot each, let's say. You've cut out the running line. And you threw them into the swimming pool, where the intermediate is going to sink at 1.5 inches per second. The Type 3 will go at 3 inches per second. The Type 6 will go in at 6 inches per second. But they'll all hit the bottom. It'll just take longer for the intermediate and the Type 3. But they will all end up on the bottom of the swimming pool. In current, not so much. Because the current cancels out the gravity, and it cancels out gravity more for the intermediate than the Type 3, and for the Type 3 more than the Type 6, it means there's the intermediate current, there's a Type 3 in current, there's a Type 6 in current. So you're getting more depth out of the Type 6 than you will out of the Type 3, and the same thing for the Type 3 versus the intermediate. The important thing to think of is that in current, especially if it's a strong current, that Type 6 will be held up by the current. It will never hit the bottom because the current is holding it up. So it's an important consideration that people often misunderstand. They think a Type 6, if you toss that into current, it's going to end up on the bottom. Well, if the current isn't very strong, that'll be true. If my local river, the Grand, if I go over to the Grand and throw a Type 6 in it and normal flows, it's going to be laying on the bottom. Even an intermediate, full intermediate, in low flows will hit the bottom and stay there. So we're relying on the current to hold that full sinker up so it never hits the bottom. And it will stay that way all through the current. It will stay at that level. Current slows down, it'll go down a bit. Current speeds up, it'll come up a little bit. But it's going to stay at an angle. It will never lay on the bottom if you're using the right sink rate for the river. So let's keep that in mind when you're talking about full sinkers, is that when we give you those sink rates of 1.5 inches per second, 3 inches per second, 6 inches per second, those are the still water sink rates. Think swimming pool. And when we're talking about a river, it's what angle it will swing at. The more dense the line, the greater the angle it will swing at, and the deeper it will go. So that's where we're going with full sinkers. So why would we want to use a full sinker? Well, there are a number of good reasons. I mean, when I fish Lake Erie, for example, out of a boat, I've caught bass in over 20 feet of water using a full sinker. So if we're in still water situations, you can get exceptionally deep with a full sinker. I mean, you're getting down, and you can get down into, if you can cast far enough, you can get down to some ridiculous depths with them. If you want to get into cold water situations, like for example, one of my favorite lines here, this is no longer made. This is about 14 years. I've had this 14, 15 years. It's a slow intermediate. It's fantastic winter line. I've caught a load of steelhead in water that's like just barely above freezing. And, this line presents so slowly and so beautifully in cold water. I mean, there's ample reason for doing it. The biggest reason for fishing a full sinker is when we're fishing a streamer or a wet fly. It gets it down, which is one thing. And you can say, well, a sink tip does the same job. It'll get it down too. There's an important difference here. Really important, especially for streamers. One of the reasons why I like sink tips for streamers is that when I'm fishing a sink tip, right, I cast into the current, down it goes. Let's say it's 10 foot of T14, for example. And it's swinging in current. It's swinging like this, right? That sounds good. Now I start to strip it. What I've effectively done when I start stripping that fly is I have had done the same thing as if I increased the current speed. Up it goes. And I've actually stood on a bank and watched people strip their flies back after they've swung them out. So they've swung them out on a sink tip, and they start to strip it back. Guess where the fly is? About that much underneath the water. Once you've increased that current speed enough by a combination of the current and your stripping, you significantly increase the lift of the line, and up that sink tip goes, almost level. When I first got into fishing sink tips about 25 years ago, I got talked into it by the store owner saying, oh, that's all you need. You don't need full sinkers. Fine. I never used a sink tip before. So I went out and I was fishing a sink tip. And I thought feel a bang, bang, and I thought I was hitting rocks. No, it was small trout whacking the fly and not hooking up. And I didn't realize how shallow I was running until one fish actually broke the surface while it hit the fly. You imagine my surprise when a fish swirled on my fly and hit my fly, and its fin broke the surface. I mean, my fly was about that far underneath the water when I was stripping it. That's the reason why we want to use intermediates and full sinkers, because they run at a very shallow angle. When we strip them, they rise very little because they're already at a shallow angle as we're swinging them, as we're fishing them. So when you're pulling an intermediate through the water, your sink tip is running like this until you start to strip it, then it goes like that. But the intermediate is running like this, just a little angle. So when you strip it, it stays flat all the way until it gets close to you, and then it starts to go up a little bit as it gets close to you. But other than that, they stay down, and that's the big thing. I can fish an intermediate. If I'm stripping a streamer back, I can fish an intermediate much deeper than I can a sink tip. An intermediate's only going down at 1.5 inches per second. That sink tip could be a type 8, which is 8 inches per second, or it could be T14. And because of the lift on that sink tip, when I start stripping that fly, up goes the fly. I'm no longer down where the fish are, where that intermediate is getting the fly down where the fish are. And when I swing wet flies in current, I've got my diving caddis. I pulse my diving caddis. Well, if I do that with a sink tip, up it goes. If I do that with an intermediate, it stays down. And I have caught a ton of fish on intermediate lines. I've had 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 fish days on intermediate lines because they get the fly down where the fish are. You're with a floater, you're asking the fish to come up. And even with the sink tip, if you're stripping a streamer, you're asking the fish to come up. And they don't always do that. I'm getting the fly down where the fish are with my intermediate and my full sinker. And when I'm stripping those flies, they're staying down. Those flies are staying near the bottom. They're not being pulled back to the surface by the act of me stripping. That's the reason why I use a full sinker in a river. Is because when I want to strip a fly or swing a fly through varying currents, the fly will stay down. and they'll stay where the fish are. And even when I'm stripping it back, it's still down. So if there's fish hugging the bank, they'll hit it. There's tremendous advantages to fishing a full sinker. So when we get into the video on fishing a full sinker, I will discuss some of the casting challenges and some of the other issues you can run into with a full sinker, but also a lot of the advantages as well. But I want to get that across, that the full sinker is an effective fishing tool. You shouldn't be afraid of the thing. And if you get some full sinkers into your gear bag and start fishing them in rivers as well as lakes, you'll find you'll catch a ton more fish. So stay tuned to the next videos. We're going to have one on intermediate and one on fishing full sinkers. Cheers.